Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, Sarah, Lucas, Giuseppe. I'm really happy to be here presenting today my work. Um, so let me just, okay, there you go. I cannot multitask. So thank you, and thanks for everyone who is listening or watching my presentation. So I'm going to present this paper, which evaluates the impact of the Venezuelan Nexus on Colombian labor markets using a novel strategy to identify where immigrants locate. So let me give you a little bit about the context. This is very important because there has been an increase in the number of immigrants around the world, but if you're attending this seminar, you're already very interested in migration. So I'm just gonna say that the recent migration from Venezuela to the rest of the world is estimated to have around 4 million migrants. And Colombia is the country that has hosted the highest number of immigrants with 1.8 million by 2019. Now, regarding the policy responses, many countries have different entry barriers, for example, bans, visas, quotas. But something that has happened with Colombia is that it has kept an open border policy, which is they allowed immigrants to enter freely or with very low requirements. And they also issued many work permits that allow them to enter the labor market without any issue. So what do we know about the effects of immigrants on labor markets? We know a lot of things. But basically, we find that there are mixed results when we study developed countries, mostly because immigrants are imperfect substitutes of the locals. So take the example of Mexicans in the US, just to say one example. So most of the profile from Mexicans that arrive in the US it's a little bit different, and in a particular issue, for example, in communication skills. So something that they have found in the literature is that maybe there are no effects because locals will specialize in activities that they are relatively better at. So, for example, in activities that require communication skills, while immigrants will go to other activities that they are relatively better to. So but in general, the literature has found either zero effects or negative effects or even positive effects, depending on the model, depending on the time that has elapsed since the arrival of the immigrant, the policies, etc. But something that happens here is that there is less evidence in south to south migration. So some evidence it's by, for example, Leonardo Bonilla and his colleagues, by Ana Maria Ibañez, Dani Bahar, Sandra Rosso, and then also from other contexts like Syrians in Turkey, we have many evidence of what happens. So to motivate this issue further, I'm gonna briefly summarize the context in Colombia. A large portion of the labor force Venezuelans represent now a large portion of the labor force in terms of the percentage change that they brought to the picture. So they are currently estimated to be 3.6% of Colombia's population or 72% of Colombia's labor force. And something that is particular about this context is that there are high levels of informality, which means immigrants may not be required to have work permits to actually work because there are many other sources that they can use. And this issue of substitution that we had in developed countries is no longer valid here. In this case, well, we are culturally similar. Venezuelans and Colombians share the same language, and the education profile is more or less the same. So in this context, an open door policy would mean that if we were to find an effect of immigration on labor markets, it is going to be in this context, just because they are so similar to us. Now, one of the issues is that, and how I came up with this idea, is that it is very hard to know where immigrants settle if the government doesn't have good records of where they are. And that happened at the beginning of the arrival of the Venezuelans. We knew that they were entering the country, but we didn't know where they were settling. So unofficial records also, like for example, they open registration offices in different points in the country, but registering in a registration office doesn't mean that you work there. You could register, for example, the border location and then go to the south or so of the country. Well, because of this and because of other things that I'm going to explain during the presentation, only 1/3 or close to 1/3 of the Venezuelans that are in Colombia are actually documented and are actually registered. Well, by the end of 2019, it was only 1/3.
Sorry, Julieth, if I interrupt you. Somebody is asking whether you know what is the size of the informal labor market. Maybe there is some estimate out there.
Yes, I think it's about I don't know, like 55 to 60%, something like that. But I might be wrong, and I apologize for that. I will show you in the summary statistics that exact number. But thank you, Giuseppe. So what I do is to use this particular setting and the timeline, the specific timeline that I'm using, that I will explain later, but basically the Exodus started in July 2016. I use that particular day to evaluate, using a difference in differences model, whether wages and employment change because of immigration. So one of the main questions of this paper is to know where immigrants settle. And for that, I will use the internet search intensity of keywords that Venezuelans are more likely to use, or that Venezuelans use, but Colombians are very less likely to use. So I use this difference in differences model, and then my findings are that I don't find or find very little effects in formal and informal employment. And I find that wages don't change. And if anything, for every $10 that a Colombian earns, there's a decrease of about 6 cents. So it's a very negligible effect. So briefly, I'm going to explain the context. I'm then going to explain the empirical strategy and the data description, in particular how these Google searches work in this particular context, the results, some robustness checks, and some final remarks. So the main historical event that I want you to focus on is the one on July 2016. What happened was that there was some political tensions between Colombia and Venezuela, and the president Maduro ordered to close the border. In August 2015, there were some tensions, inflation rose, everything was going, like food was scarce, etc. And after 1 year, they reopened borders, and that's the first time where we see that monthly net migration, which is what the graph on the right is showing, for in the 3 main entry points increased. That's the it seems like a little peak right now, but at the moment it was huge. And then obviously after that, there were some events also that that unleashed this immigration wave. How are these immigrants? So they are younger than the average Colombian. Usually they work longer hours and they are paid less per hour, but they have more or less the same levels of education as Colombians. This has that was at the beginning, and this has changed a little bit over time. So for example, the graph is showing the percentage or the distribution of education every year of immigrants. And what this is showing is that some of them, or about 40% of them, had a bachelor's degree, or those who were entering in 2016, but in 2019 that proportion shrank. So the profile has changed over time, but overall, like throughout after 2016, it has remained more or less the same as locals. So my empirical strategy, I use a difference in differences design, where I use two outcomes, wages and employment, in two sectors, the formal and the informal sector. And the way I'm going to define formal or informal is whether the person is affiliated to Social Security and to retirement plan. And then I have an indicator that changes per region and over time that tells me the intensity of immigration. So this indicator is the number of immigrants as a share of the labor force. And I will explain how I came up with this indicator. And I also control for potential experience, experience square, gender, education. And I, of course, test for the parallel trends assumption. So about the data from the side of the labor market outcomes, it comes from Gran Encuesta Integrada de Hogares. This is a repeated cross-section. I use the monthly sample from January 2013 to December 2019. This data contains 13 metropolitan areas and 30 departments. And what this graph is showing is the distribution of wages of immigrants compared to locals. So on the x-axis, you have the percentile in the non-immigrant wage distribution. So the gray line is the distribution of wages for Colombians. And then the blue line is depicting the wages, the actual wages of Venezuelans, while the dark blue line, dotted line, it's the predicted wage. So what this is showing is what would happen with an immigrant if he was paid exactly the same as a Colombian, in the case they have the same education, the same experience, and the same characteristics. So if they were paid more or less the same as a Colombian, then we would be in the dotted dark blue line. But the actual wage is showing that they are concentrated in the bottom part of the distribution. What this means is that Venezuelans are receiving less wages for exactly the same education and experience as a Colombian. So, and this usually happens in different contexts of immigration, and usually happens within the first 2 years after arrival. So this is a normal pattern. And something that this graph is telling us is that, for example, an engineer from Venezuela is not competing with an engineer in Colombia, but rather they are going through two low wage occupations. So they are focusing on basically in the informal market. This is what this graph, how this graph could be interpreted. So when I check the parallel trends assumptions, what we want to see is first that the trend or cities that receive more immigrants did not had particular patterns in wages and employments. For example, those cities were not having a higher growth in wages or higher growth in employment. To test for that, so I do this event study where I divide the whole sample in two types of cities. One that had a migration rate above the median, and another set that had a migration rate below the median. When I compare these two groups of cities over time, what I obtain is the coefficients that are on the graph. So what we want to guarantee is that before the start of this migration wave, all of these coefficients are close to zero. That means cities that receive lots of immigrants were not seeing larger increases in wages as compared to cities that did not receive a large wave of immigrants. And this is what this is showing. In the case of formal, in the formal sector, I do a similar event study, and I found more or less that statistically those coefficients are statistically equal to 0, and then the same for informality. Now, how do I define the geographical location of immigrants? So as I said, I use Google or internet searches of keywords to identify where they settle. And I use 3 sets of keywords. The first ones that are trying to assess where they are going to, where their networks are. So for example, I use the words Venezolanos en or Venezuelans in, which is, and the idea behind this is that some of them would look for support groups or ONGs that are helping them. And those 2 words are very key for them to find this type of groups. Now, the other set of groups is employment. For example, PTP, PEP, and RAMP. RAMP is the census of immigrants that happened in 2018, but PTP and PEP are the short, the acronyms for the works permit that the government of Colombia issued, and also the acronyms for the words of other countries' work permits too. And the reason why I use these 2 is because they are located in the national territory, and what I want to do is to identify them. So even if they have an intention to leave, I can still identify them by using this type of word. And another one that is not on the slide, another set of words, are things that they are particularly more interested in searching because of their preferences. So for example, Dollar Today, which is a platform where they can see how dollar exchange rates are evolving. And anecdotal evidence says that they usually use it. So I use these monthly searches. What I obtain from these keywords is an index from 0 to 100, where 100 is the location that had the largest number of searches for those keywords. So I transform this index, and what we can obtain, for example, for January 2017, is the distribution of immigrants in Colombia. That's the objective of the index. And then we can obtain, or what I do is to obtain that is distribution for each month after July 2016. So let me go a little bit further on how this works and how I construct the immigration shock measure. I use this index that again is the distribution of immigrants in the national territory for a specific month. And then I multiply that with the net migration to Colombia. So the nationwide cumulative net migration. And I divide it by this index plus the size of the labor force. So what the measure of immigration is showing in the regression is how an increasing 1 percentage point in the number of immigrants as a percentage of the labor force can change wages or employment.
May I just ask a clarification question? Yes. So you're using this Google searches as a direct measure of the number of immigrants, or is this an instrument that you use to predict the actual number of immigrants?
It is the direct measure. I do robustness checks using the instrument of past networks and this index, because the main thing here is to know how exactly, or in the best way we can, where they are located. And official records, because of some reasons that I'm gonna after this slide explain, it's not a complete measure as of December 2019. Yeah. It might change in the future, right? But something.
Let me please ask another question that Etienne just typed in, and he's asking whether is it possible that some poorer regions that have less access to internet could lead to underestimation in those regions?
That's true. That's true. That might happen. But let me show you, given that I have this slide here, how internet coverage works in Colombia. So the regions where the most populated regions are where there are a bunch of points too. The other regions are mostly selvatic. They have lots of armed conflict. Well, in the past they have had lots of armed conflict. So they have a combination of particulars. It's a particular setting where they are not very populated. So in Colombia, most of the population is in the points that you see there, and the government has implemented this kioscos Vivi Digital, which is a strategy to give access to free Wi-Fi points. So in theory, 98% of this municipality have Wi-Fi access in the center town, so they can go with any device and they can go and connect to these free access points for up to 60 minutes each time, so they can reconnect immediately after the connection ends, etc. So it seems that that might be a problem. I recognize that, but it is not. It doesn't seem to be a huge problem of connection throughout the territory.
Thanks. Before you go further, there are another two questions that might be worth to ask now. So another one is asking, Anuj is asking whether you can, in a way, distinguish whether the search is made by a native or not. I mean, it's not asking whether you can distinguish, but whether this could bias it. I paraphrase. And then we have Victor, who is asking how different in the distribution of the Venezuelan workforce across industries and sectors, how different that is from the Colombian, and whether there is a concentration among Venezuelans in industry with a low mass of employed Colombians for migration. You can see them also in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you. So regarding the first one, I cannot distinguish the sources of a Colombian and a Venezuelan, and that's the reason why I use keywords to identify who is more likely to Google. And let's say, for example, why would this work? Let's say we are in the context of the US, where there are green cards that people can get hardly. But if you are an American, for example, you wouldn't be really interested in knowing the process to access a green card, right? Because you're already a citizen. So in thinking of in the same way, Colombians would be less likely to look for the work permits, for example, just because they would not be interested in accessing a work permit if they are already Colombians. So yeah. So I think in that case, yes, I cannot distinguish a Colombian from a Venezuelan, but very likely these words are mostly searched by Venezuelans. And regarding the second question, yes, so they are concentrated. Venezuelans are concentrated in service industry, and I will show you if I have time. The heterogeneous effects across industry and how they distribute like across industries. They are usually going to this service industry, maybe because it is easier for them to go there, and to low occupation skills, also because there are high levels of informality, and then again they don't require work permits or any type of paperwork to work there. But let me.
Okay, thanks. So we will let you on. I see there are other questions. We will do them in the end.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so when I compare these internet searches in this index with official records, what I find is that the distribution is at the national level is different. So, for example, the official records are saying 1 in 3 Venezuelan immigrants are located in Bogota, while the internet searches says 1 in 5 Venezuelan immigrants are located in Bogota. So where does this difference come from? Well, there are many things in official records. In 2018, they launched this huge program to register immigrants. They opened these registration offices close to the border and in main cities. So it might happen that Venezuelan immigrants that were not close to a registration point never registered. And that's why we have an overestimation of Venezuelans in a main city such as Bogota. Another reason is that registration actually is costly because the immigrant has to go to the office and pay transportation costs to actually register. So, and also has to give up time to do the line and do the paperwork. So in general, internet searches might have a better coverage, and that's why it is identifying that the national distribution of immigrants would put less weight to Bogota than if we were to take into account the official records. Now, one of the questions is this a good measure? I do kind of the same algorithm to identify where immigrants settle here in the US using the words green card, just that. It's a very simple example. And what I find is that so green card ratios are on the right, it's the green map, and the percentage of foreign born per state is on the left. And what I find is a correlation of 0.85. So the correlation is huge. It seems that actually those two numbers really match. The distribution of searches and people foreign born match. So again, why is this different, like the official records compared to the Google searches? Because the registration points were located in certain locations, usually large cities and borders. Registration is voluntary and costly. And actually what we find is like more than 1/3 of immigrants have registered by the end of 2019. But again, it's only 1/3. Where is the rest? And then another thing that I mentioned at the beginning is that where the place you register is not necessarily the place you will work at. So in that sense, also the Google searches could be a better measure to identify where in the national territory they are located. Regarding the effects, what I find is that using this measure on wages, formal and informal, I find that there is a small decrease in wages in the formal sector. And the way you can interpret this is an increase in 1 percentage point in the number of immigrants as a percentage of the labor force will decrease wages in the informal sector by 0.6%. So it is a pretty small effect that could be well a zero effect. In the formal sector, I don't find any effect. Regarding employment, I see a very small effect that it's only significant at the 10% level on formal employment, and actually the sign is positive, but I wouldn't interpret this as an effect. It seems that it's actually zero. And the same happens with informal sector. When I do heterogeneous effects,
sorry, just a quick question. The employment, is it restricted to Colombian employment, or is it both Colombian and Venezuelan?
Yes, that's a good question. And sorry, I didn't mention it. Yes, this paper only focuses on what is happening with Colombians. So what is happening with those, and particularly what is happening with those Colombians that have never migrated. And that have a secondary completed or lower education, just because that's where they are mostly getting that is where they are mostly in the informal sector, and that's where Venezuelans are mostly entering. So yes, so it's only about Colombians. I don't look at effects on Venezuelans because the sample it's very small. Oops, it was here in gender. Okay. Thanks for the question. So when I look at the effects by gender, what I find is that female are less likely to suffer the effects of or negative effects from migration. Actually, they perceive more, or they go to more formal jobs because of immigration. But again, this effect is it's very small. How this can be interpreted is that remember that M is a 1 percentage point increase in the number of Venezuelan immigrants as a share of the labor force can increase formal jobs for female compared to men by 0.9%. So it's a very, very small effect. Something that usually happens in the literature is that immigrants, and mostly low-skilled immigrants, are competing with jobs or are competing more with the younger population, because the younger population doesn't have experience and might be also low educated. So the results that I show in this table is a heterogeneous effect by age category, and the size of the effects are kind of consistent with this theory. However, the sizes are very small. So what I find is that Venezuelans are mostly affecting those people aged 15 to 24, and then the least affected are those that are aged 45 to 54. But the effects of this model are very, very small. So I wouldn't interpret it as a negative effect. Regarding the question about occupation, so Venezuelan immigrants are entering mostly clerical support workers. They are also becoming service workers, and they are working in elementary occupations. Those are the three main occupations. And when I do evaluate the effect of migration in these particular industries, what I find is nothing as well. So nothing in the formal and informal sector for clerical support workers, a positive effect in the formal sector for service workers, but again, this effect is very small. And on elementary occupations, I find no effects. So one of the good things about the difference in differences model is that we can obtain a coefficient that is available, that could be used at the national level, or that is the weighted average at the national level. But one would wonder what could happen with a city that had a really high influx of immigration. So what I do as a robustness check is to compute robustness, to compute city level effects using an artificial counterfactual methodology. This methodology works in the following way. I aggregate the data at the city or department level to create a panel time series, and then I divide the sample. I compute an artificial counterfactual per each city that has had a high level of immigration or immigration above the median. And I use as donor countries, or as donor cities, those that have had less than the median. I feed the data using an elastic net and the pre-treatment period, and then using the same model, I project it for the post-treatment period. And by comparing the artificial counterfactual with the actual data, I can find the effect. This is called the ARCO estimator. But let me summarize what this means in a graph. It's better always with graphs. So the black line in both graphs are showing the actual data. The green line is showing the fitted model using the elastic net methodology. And then the blue line is the projection in the post-treatment period. The post-treatment period is after July 2016. And then the treatment would be the difference between the black line and the blue line. So what I find in this case, this is the case of Cucuta, which is a border city that has had a large number of immigrants arriving to that city. And what I find is probably negative effects really at the end of 2019, in the case of informal wages, and positive effects on employment really at the end of 2019 again. But when I compute this at the country level, I find that on average, the results are consistent with the differences model. So these are the results. The effects are shown in columns 1 and 4 for the informal and the formal sector, and columns 2, 3, 5, 6 are the lower and upper bounds. So just to point out at one example, in the case of employment, Bogota, which is a large city that also has received a lot of immigrants, and it's the capital city, we find that the effect is 0.7, which is small and is consistent with the results of the differences models, and it is within the bounds, so it is basically not significant for the formal and the informal sector. And oops, what did I do? And then in the case of wages, so 2 examples I want to point out of diverse effects. One is Atlántico. It's a department in Colombia, and Bucaramanga, which is a city that also has received, both have received lots of immigrants. On the one hand, we have Atlántico that has increased wages in the formal sector, and the formal sector too, and those increases have been significant. And on the other case, we have Bucaramanga that has had negative effects, kind of sizable. But overall, when we compute the national effect levels, those results are equivalent to the differences model. So what this is showing is that some cities are gaining, some cities are losing, but at the national level, it seems that the effect is 0. Using Ivy, coming back to the question of Sarah at the beginning, for the last regressions, I used the indicator directly, but I also acknowledge that most of the immigration literature uses chief share, and this chief share uses the share of immigrants in a very back in time. So for example, I use the census of 2005 to identify where they are located at that time. An instrument using, and they use that measure as an instrument to identify where immigrants settle. Jagger et al. I think it is still forthcoming, but published a paper in which they say that this instrument captures 2 effects, the short-term impact and also the effect that of changes over time. And for that reason, this instrument can not give accurate estimates of what the effect of immigration on wages or employment are, but I do the results, and what I find is the following. So in terms of wages, I find an increase in formal employment and a decrease in informal employment. So for every 1 percentage point increase in the number of immigrants as a share of the labor force, informal wages, for example, are decreasing by 3.4%. While in the formal sector, they are increasing by 1.7%. And in employment, I find nothing. And the results are kind of similar to the work by Dani Bahar, Ana Maria Ibanez, and Sandra Ross. I also do regressions where I use official records, and official records are showing me more or less the same. Basically no effects on employment, on formal or informal employment, and no effects if I include or I control for the whole, for the fact that some immigrants might go also to high level occupation. So for example, an engineer could be competing with an engineer in Colombia, and so I find overall no effects. And just to wrap up, so this study focuses on the Venezuelan exodus and suggests that open door policies, such as the one that Colombia has had, do not harm labor markets in the host country. So I find no effects or no sizable effects on wages and employment. I also do robustness checks that include the effects of Colombian returnees and internal migration. And what I actually find is that Colombian returnees are actually like the coefficients or the effects are way larger compared to the ones of Venezuelan immigrants. So there might be many things happening of why we find effects of Colombian or negative effects of Colombian returnees on local wages and employment. One of the things that these returnees have already work permits, so they might be competing in different industries. They might not have accent, or they might so these xenophobic issues might not be showing for this population. That might be happening too. And they could also be going to where their networks are, and therefore it is easier for them to find employment through their networks and to increase competition, while a Venezuelan immigrant might not have access to that kind of network. That might happen. But overall, what I find is that Colombia's returnees do decrease wages of the local population of those Colombians that were not that did not migrate in the last 5 years, and it might affect also internal immigrants' wages. I find some minor effects on young workers in the informal sector and for service workers, but again, those effects are very small. And one would wonder, why do I find null effects? Well, although I cannot test that because of availability of data, what usually happens in this context of immigration is that when they arrive, they consume, they pay taxes, they create small businesses, and therefore these changes in the demand might offset the changes in the supply, right? Another key message of my paper is that these measures, such as internet searches or in the future analysis of social media, might offer timely coverage of migration events, not only because you can identify where immigrants settle at one point in time, but you can also see where they are moving towards other regions. For example, in the case of Venezuela, at the beginning or in July 2016, they were mostly concentrated at the border between Venezuela and Colombia. And then after time passed, they are going more to the south or to the north, usually to the south, because they want to cross borders to go to Ecuador, Peru, Chile, etc. So, and that is really important and has lots of consequences on how we estimate these effects. So we can update information on a regular basis. And I think one of the important things to take into account in the future is that with at least social media, we can do sentiment analysis to identify some mechanisms of why we are obtaining this type of effects. And just to close the presentation, I'm just 1 minute. In about 1 minute, I have to close the presentation. But so something that, according to the national survey in Venezuela, 87% of the population are poor and 61.2% are in extreme poverty. So doing a back in the envelope calculation, we know that Colombian annual wages add up to 1.1 billion Colombian pesos in 2019. And the maximum wage loss that I found is a 0.6%. That means that they lost up to 6,700 million Colombian pesos annually. However, the wages in Venezuela in the same year added up 54 million. So if we were thinking as a government of the world, what this is saying is, okay, there are wins of having immigrants entering a country because the losses are very small. It's again a 0.6% wage loss compared to the huge win or gains that Venezuelans are having access to through wages, through employment. So we are reducing basically the indices of poverty or the perception of poverty that they used to have in their country by welcoming them. And with that, I am done. Thank you very much. I'm open to questions.
Thanks a lot, Julieth. Your presentation actually has aroused a lot of questions. So we have 4 questions from 3 different speakers, and I will give them the floor in order of the time they submitted it. So we start with Jasper, then Andres, and then Jeremy. And in the meantime, if you have other questions, we also have the panelists. So let's start with Jasper.
Perfect, thank you. So I will say his question then. I can.
I think he can unmute himself, but if you can read the question, and that's even more efficient.
Yeah, sure. You can also do like that. But basically, I can just say that the question was, given that we use internet research data, don't we have an underrepresentation of, let's say, above 50 years old migrants who are not so used to use Google research to, receive information?
Yes, that is true. That might as well happen. I acknowledge that. However, the population of immigrants that are arriving to Colombia, the average age, I believe, is 34 or 36. So they are younger, they are young immigrants, and they anecdotal evidence says that they have access to cell phones and to internet. So yes, I probably will be using this index, that population that is 50 plus. However, this immigration is mostly young people, so I would be characterizing more or less a good proportion of the population. And one of the things also to clarify is that the index could be biased if certain cities would be receiving a larger proportion of people 50 plus in there, because remember that the index is the distribution at the national level of immigrants. So for example, the index is saying in Bogota there are 20% of the total number of immigrants that were in the country in January 2019. That's an example. So if for some reason some cities are have larger numbers of people 50 plus, then the results would be biased. But if we don't have any evidence that shows that certain ages are going to certain cities, then I wouldn't be that worried with the index. But yes, that's something that I acknowledge, that I have to acknowledge. Thank you.
Thanks. Please, Andres, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Very nice. I have like 3 questions, maybe to clarification. So the first one is related to the measure that you use as your main independent variable. Mm-hmm. I was wondering why you use the share of the labor force and maybe not the share of Venezuelans relative to the number of workers employed. I think that will give a better like picture of the amount of jobs that are available by region. The second question is something that you say at the end of the presentation is related to the amount of Venezuelans who go to Colombia. So you said in several parts of the presentation, you said that your measure is above and below the median. I guess this is in one particular year, but does this change across the years, or the same municipalities and region always receive the same amount, and this is constant over time. And the last question is related to your model. When you use the instrument, it gives me the impression like you use the share of Venezuelans by regions. Is what happened with the I think you have a region fixed effects there in your model. Does not that kill the instrument? I'm just curious about that.
So yeah, thank you for your questions. Yes, I think regarding your first question, I think we're talking about exactly the same measure. Maybe I put it in the wrong words or so, but the share that I'm talking about is as I will go back, is the number of immigrants, of Venezuelan immigrants. Let me put it on the screen. There you go. I think it's this one. Yeah. So the number on top is actually the number of Venezuelan immigrants estimated using the Google searches index, but it's the number of Venezuelan immigrants that are in Colombia, well, that are in region R at time T, divided over the number of Venezuelan immigrants, which is again this product, plus NRO, which is the Colombian labor force. So what I meant by this index, and I think it's the same that you had in mind, is this is actually showing the share of Venezuelan immigrants, or the number of immigrants, as a share of the whole labor force, including immigrants, which is, I think, what you had in mind. The second one about comparisons above or below the median, yeah, that's a good question. So what I showed today was I compute the average migration rate of every city over time after July 2016, and that's how I created that measure. So it's the average after this migration shock happened. So it's constant over time for that model that I'm showing today. I do in the robustness checks, or in an appendix that I will upload probably within the next month. I do different checks for different types of measures regarding that. And for the IV, so for the IV, that's a good question. Remember that this measure of immigration changes over time and per region. So when I include regional fixed effects, I still have variation, right? Because this measure changes over time by region. I think, yeah, I think that might answer your question.
But the instrument is in 2005, right? That will mean only 1 year.
That's the instrument for this variable, yes.
So if it is only one year in 2005, and then you put the region fixed effects, then each region is going to have the same number, right?
Oh, I see. And on the first stage you're talking about, yeah, no, that's a good point. No, the first stage doesn't have regional fixed effects, just because of what you say. Okay. I think so, but let me check that.
No, and regarding the first question, it's like I always have this doubt, because I think that people have been using sometimes like the number of total labor force, right? But why don't you just use the number of people who is an employee, who has the number of workers, basically? But I guess it's fine. It's just curiosity. Why to use?
Yeah. So why? So your question is why the labor force and not why people employed?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, just because the employment might be more volatile than the labor force, just because of that reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
I think that given the sheer amount of questions that we are receiving, raise hands, Q&A, it's probably too much. So I invite all the attendees to write an email to Julieth. I guess, I mean, let's first close the seminar. So maybe Sarah can go ahead, and then maybe who wants to stay,
Yeah.
you know.
No, I would
can ask
suggest
the
all of those that still had questions, please feel free to stay on. We can have a discussion continuing here. If Juliet, you're still available for a few
Sure.
minutes.
Sure,
I'll just, if you can unshare your screen, I'll just close the session for those that have to leave.
Yes, I just, for those who have to leave also, that's my email in case you have more questions. But yeah, I will stop here. Thank you. Thank you
like,
for the
this
invite.
like
And
the ad time. Stay with us for another 2 minutes. We have an ad and then we're coming back.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Just very quickly, next week we'll have Sara Giunti from the University of Milano Bicocca, who's going to tell us the refugee crisis and right-wing populism. And as you know, you can see all of our upcoming presentations on our website. And we're still receiving submission for this semester. So if you have a paper that you would like to present and you're a junior researcher, please feel free to send it to us to our email junioreconomic@gmail.com. So thank you very much for joining. And if you still have questions for Juliet, just feel free to stay on and we'll promote you in the panel so you can join the discussion.